I went out to Home Depot and bought a lamp. Hopefully this one, I had bought one before, and it disappeared on us, right? So they took it back to their office. So I wrote on it, right? And that way, hopefully nobody will steal it from us. I scratch my name, right? Like a hoarder or something. But in any event, we need it in here in order to take notes, and that will help. Okay, so on whatever the last day we met, Thursday, we were talking about the International Gothic style. That's a term that art historians have applied to works of art made around 1400, which show the influence of art from Siena, that early Renaissance art that Duccio had been doing in particular, right? But we saw Giotto as well, and was spread north of the Alps, outside of Italy, back in the 1340s by Simone Martini, right? Easy name to remember, right? Stick an olive in it. And he goes to Avignon in the south of France, which is the home of the papacy at that point in history, in the 1300s. And he begins to work for the papal court. And he sort of begins to popularize this new realistic style, but in particular the Siena version of it, which is kind of elegant and colorful. Much more elegant and colorful than Giotto's was. And so this becomes sort of the kernel of the International Gothic style, because after it ends up in Avignon with the papacy and various patrons there, it spreads from there to the French royal court, because the papacy was, remember, appointed by the French king at that point. So there's a tight political connection between the two. And the new art that shows up in Avignon almost immediately begins to show up in Paris as well, right? And from there, because the King of France was medieval diplomacy, was by marriage. That's how you made alliances, was you married off your kids to the kids of somebody else, right? And so from Paris, the style that began in Siena begins to spread to almost every other court in Europe because of the intermarriages, right? And they all see it and they go, ooh la la, I want that too, right? And so we were looking at this little fragment of a polyptych, right, multiple panels that folded up, that was commissioned by the Duke of Burgundy, Duke Philip the Bold, which we talked about on Thursday, and was made by artists from his realm, which is what we today call the Burgundian Netherlands. The Netherlands means Low Countries, right? So it's what's today Belgium and Holland, right? But in the 14th, 15th centuries, Belgium and Holland didn't exist as countries yet, right? They were governed by the Duke of Burgundy. So we refer to it as the Burgundian Netherlands because that's kind of the best way to define what the country was, right? And he, through marriage, the Duke of Burgundy, owned Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, parts of Germany, parts of northern France. He sort of stitched together a fairly large territory, and Worksheet 2 sort of talked about him, right? He's the same guy who paid for the Moses well, okay? Was the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, okay? And this was made for his private use, right? For his private prayers, and it's meant to fold up pretty small, right? A box that he could take with him on his travels as he moved through his realm and use it for private prayer, right? And so we were looking at the crucifixion scene. We'd already looked at the Annunciation scene, which has a lot of similarities to Simone and Martini's Annunciation, but it's got significantly more detail. And what we'll see as we look at artists from this region, the Burgundian Netherlands, which is what we'll talk about a lot today, is that these artists become particularly interested in almost microscopic detail. Right? Now that's anachronistic because the microscope didn't exist, right? But with really particular tiny details rendered extraordinarily realistically. And we're on the road there with works like this, right? So the throne that the Virgin sits on in the Annunciation is more detailed than what we had seen before this, right? We've begun to see three-dimensional thrones, but now we've got all that filigree, the roof tiles, the windows behind her, right? And the crucifixion is a little bit more particularized, but you can see down at the bottom with the angel at the foot that there's all these flowers as well beneath the feet of the Virgin Mary and St. John. Right? So an increasing interest in sort of realistic detail rather than just three-dimensional qualities, which is what we started with. Now let's look at as we talk about the International Gothic style, it really is truly international. It's not just limited to these direct sort of connections, because the Duke of Burgundy was the younger brother of the French king, and by this point was sort of the uncle of the French king because the older brother had died, right? So he's directly by blood related to the French throne. But in Cologne, in Germany, there isn't so direct a connection, but still there's this idea that this style spreads. And if we look at this panel from the National Gallery, we can see that it's in its broader strokes really similar to the one on the left from the Walters. Right? These are both local works. Christ's body is sort of really thin arms, right? Really elongated legs. Virgin Mary on the left, St. John on the right, in both of them. So the same cast of characters, some similar stylistic elements. We have the gold background, which is traditional. This one has the original frame, right? And usually pictures at this point were painted on wooden panels, and sometimes those wooden panels were actually engaged with the frame as the artist paints it, right? And that's the case here. So we see the original engaged framer on the outside. And just like the Walters piece, we have angels flying around gathering the blood of Christ, right? So I'll show you some details, but you can see that the ones at the top, it's sort of, I would guess, if you think about Christ's head, it's the face of a clock. At like 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock, right, those ones are getting the blood from his hands, and there's one down below by his feet as well. And the one at like 7 o'clock, right, is getting the blood coming out of his side. Whereas the one at like 5 o'clock is just sad, right? There to mourn the loss of Christ, just like the angels on the Moses one, right? Are there to mourn the death of Christ as well. And so here's some details. So you can see, and in this case, the outline of the chalice, right, the cup, has actually been outlined in black by the artist. This is just some damaged panel, and you can see the blood here gathering it there. You can also see how the gold has been manipulated so that we can see the halo as part of the gold sort of upraised in relief this way, which is something we've seen going back to Giada, right? So again, this reminds the viewer, you and me, the owner of this piece, that in fact Christ's sacrifice is related to the sacrament of the communion, right? This is the blood of Christ that is shed for you, and they hold chalices very similar to the chalice that the priest would hold when you took communion, right? So there's a direct visual connection to this. We've got a couple of other characters in addition to John and the Virgin Mary in this. On the left is this fairly well-dressed figure who is probably St. Longinus. Now, this is not something that you find really spoken about in the Bible, but became part of Catholic tradition going back to about the 13th century. St. Longinus was the centurion, the Roman soldier, who pierced the side of Christ with the lance during the crucifixion. And according to the Bible, this much is there, right? A soldier pierced his side, doesn't give his name, right? But when he does, blood and water flow out, right? And according to a non-biblical but well-known tradition, Longinus was saved by this. He converted after he did this. And the way that the story panned out is that Longinus, according to legend, right, the same legend that gave him his name, was blind. And as the blood ran down the lance, he touched his eyes with it and was miraculously healed. And the physical sight of Christ led into the spiritual revelation. I have seen the Savior, right? That's what he says. And so if you look at this, and you also look at sort of the darkness of his eyes, it's almost as if he's as someone who's just now had sight revealed, right? Now the artist's name, the master of St. Veronica, he didn't sign any of his works. In fact, most artists at this time period did not sign their works because they didn't see themselves as creative geniuses in the way that artists tend to in other later periods, right? They saw this as a craft, and they saw the making of the work as a bit of a prayer, if you will, a devotional act, right? If they can make a painting well, they do God a better service, right? So the master of St. Veronica painted a number of pictures that we think are all by the same person because they look really similar stylistically, right? And there's a great number of them that are images of St. Veronica. So we've just given him this nickname, the master of St. Veronica, right? And there are a lot of these artists in the early Renaissance whose names we don't know that are like the master of the bent pinky. I kid you not, right? I mean, there's the master of the embroidered drapery. Because there's this certain things that tie a bunch of works together, but we don't have records that link a name to any given one of them, right? So the master of St. Veronica is our artist at hand, right? And he's included this other figure of St. Longinus having a revelation. I think for us, that's also something of a bit of an instruction, if you will, right? Look and believe, right? See and believe. Like St. Longinus. It becomes a metaphor, if you will. He's our surrogate in the picture. The fellow on the right is a contemporary. He's not part of the biblical story. He's a contemporary to the viewer, right? He's a 14th, 15th century person. And he's dressed in white robes. He has this funky haircut that gives him a donut ring, which is called a tonsure, right? It's a monastic haircut. It's an outward symbol that you've taken your monastic vows. For some of us, it just happens, right? Male pattern baldness. I'm looking at you, Bill, because one day, unless you're really lucky, right, it happens to us all. But they're shaved to look that way, right? And the robe identifies him, the white robe, as a monk from a particular order. He's a Carthusian. The Carthusian monks wore white, right? And that's how we can identify who exactly he is, right? Now, exactly which monk, we're not 100% sure. It may well be, and this is not uncommon, it may well be that he is a portrait of the person who paid for it, the original owner of the piece, and he then gets to look at himself looking at Jesus. Kind of cool, right? And it reiterates that idea of Longinus' miraculous vision, that's sort of what he's emulating, is that miraculous conversion, if you will, that miraculous vision. At the same time, he may just be a surrogate for any given Carthusian monk. This may have been made, it's about like this, so it's a bit too big to be porting around with you, right? So it's probably made for a chapel, or maybe a monastic cell in a monastery, right? The room of the monk. But in any event, it may be just a surrogate for any Carthusian who looked at it, right? A sort of generic image of a Carthusian monk rather than actually a portrait of a given individual, right? We don't know for sure because we don't know who owned it, and we don't obviously have pictures of who owned it, even if we did, right? So we can't really compare what he looked at. Right? So we know for a fact that the St. Veronica piece, the crucifixion on the right, was made for a Carthusian monastery. We know that much for sure. No one else would want a Carthusian there except someone from a Carthusian monastery. And it may well have been made for this particular monk that we see here. But again, we can't prove that. By total coincidence, sorry that says that. This is the Walters piece. Bad, forget the label, right? The one on the left was made also for a Carthusian monastery, and we know this not from what's in the picture, but from archive records, right? That this was commissioned by Philip the Bold of Burgundy and used by him during his lifetime, and then later donated to a Carthusian monastery. And this comes from the second worksheet, right, that we went over Duke Philip the Bold founded this Carthusian monastery outside of the city of Dijon, right? The chapter house of Champmont, right? And he had a couple of reasons for founding a monastery. One, right? The monks will pray for you. Good, right? For Christians. There's a whole group of guys praying for you all the time. There's that, right? Two, he wanted to retire there at the end of his life as a monk. Don't ask what his wife thought about that, right? Three, the monastery was going to function as a mausoleum for his family, right? He was going to be buried there at the end of his life, and his heirs would be buried there as well, okay? Now, it turns out that he didn't end up retiring there, but he was buried there. And so was his son, and so was his grandson, and so was his great-grandson. Right? We're all buried there, all members of the same family. So maybe even his great-great-grandson. I'm trying to trace it through my mind. Right? So the chapter house of Champmont outside Dijon is also a Carthusian monastery, and this was gifted there as well. Right? There's connections between these things. And like I said, the second worksheet deals with this incredible sculpture, very realistic, what we talked about at the beginning of class, sort of hyper-realistic sculpture of the Moses well, which is just the base of a bigger group, right, with a crucifixion on top, a well down below, and these extraordinary sculptures of prophets who foretold the coming of the Messiah. And it was originally in the middle of the cloister that connected the cells of the monks in the field in the center, right above the well that provided the water for the monastery, right? Our little polyptych would have been in the chapel, which is here, right? And Klaus Sluter also did the front of the chapel, and it still survives. You can go visit it, by the way, in Dijon. And it's actually, the only things that survive are the Moses well and the front of the chapel. There's still a chapel there, but it was rebuilt in the 19th century. The rest of it is an asylum, right? An insane asylum. And they're not out wandering around or anything, right? But you're visiting a hospital still, right? At the time. And so you come to a little gatehouse here to visit the Moses wells. If you're ever in the area and not eating cheese, make a point. It's really worth it to go see. In fact, even at the time that this was made, I don't know if I said this in the online bit that you used, but even at the time it was made, it was seen as an extraordinary piece to go visit. And the Pope, was this in there? In 1416 or so, about 10 years after Sluter had died, and after Philip the Bold had died, the Pope gave an indulgence to anybody who visited this. It was seen as an indulgence got you time out of hell, or purgatory at the time, right, at the end of your life. And it was seen to actually have an effect on your spiritual life to the degree that simply visiting it was seen as a strong spiritual thing to have done. And the Pope granted favor for this, right? If you visited it in the right state of mind you got, I can't remember how big the indulgence was. It might have been a full one, right? Wipe the slate clean, right? I'd like to give you one too. You get A in this class, you go to Dijon over spring break or something like that, right? Well, other people are commissioning works of art at the same time, not just Philip the Bold, as we get a sense, right? As this realistic style that was born in Siena spreads, what we find is that the patrons are the ones that are really driving that spread. We often think of art sort of in artists see, oh, that's genius, I have to copy it. But here it seems to be the patrons who are driving the spread. And Jean de Berry is another major art patron at exactly the same time. He's the little brother of Duke Philip the Bold, right? They're related. They're both younger brothers of the French king, or by 1400, uncles of the French king because of the succession, right? And this is part of the reason why this realism spreads. And the reason it seems to turn more realistic, most people think, has to do with the artists themselves. Then it's something we can't explain because they never sat down and wrote about why. But it's a fascinating phenomenon because this realism that we see, look at this, it's a feast scene, right? So, spectacular feast taking place. Here's Philip, Jean de Berry, sitting in front of a fireplace, right? Big, massive fireplace. You see the fire screen behind him, the flames looking up behind that. And by the way, this is only about like yay, right? About 11, 12 inches tall. And you could never see it live. It's in Chantilly in France. Chantilly, France, the one after which Paris is named there. And they don't let people see it because it's too fragile, right? And they expose it to light, it fades, and every intro to art history class shows it, so everybody who goes to Chantilly wants to see it. Right? And it's in a book, which we'll talk about. But here he is at this feast, right? And he's telling these people to come visit. It says approach. And he's surrounded by courtiers in these extraordinary clothes. And look at the detail to the clothing, right? And the mismatched socks, which was kind of stylish at the time, right? We're too much into symmetry for that sort of thing, right? He was a pet owner. He had many, many dogs. He's got a greyhound down here who's been given table scraps, cute little detail. I'm a dog owner, so I was that dog. And he's a bad dog owner because he lets his little Griffin Terriers up on the table. I mean, come on, right? Who lets their dogs up on the table, right? And he's got all this extraordinary food, quail on the plates, a big gravy boat that is literally a boat, right? We have silver and gold table settings. Over here, wine, more wine being delivered, all this extraordinary gold work on the left corner. And as the people are coming through, and there's a guy drinking here, as the people are coming toward him, in the background, it almost looks like they're outside, but they're not. It's a tapestry that's hanging on the wall. Can you see that now? It's shaded in the left corner, and then sort of does the drapery thing at the top, right? So it's a piece of cloth, and it's a tapestry with a battle scene, which we can't really identify. But it's just as realistic as the figures, and it almost looks like these guys are pouring through the gate and coming right on him, right? It's a sort of trick. It's another trompe-l'oeil, right? It fools your eye into thinking it's something that it isn't, right? So, extraordinary detail here, right, in this work as well. The same enhancing of detail that we started to see when we looked at other international Gothic works, right? This is a manuscript. This is a page from an illustrated book. The word manuscript simply means written by hand, right? Script and manu in Latin, main in French, right? Is the same word. A manuscript, a handwritten book that three brothers who were artists made for Jean de Berry. Now, this particular manuscript was a prayer book. And in fact, the most popular kinds of manuscripts collected by people through the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, into the 15th century, were prayer books. And they owned them for a couple of different reasons. One, obviously, it's utilitarian, right? What this particular prayer book would do is it would tell you which prayers to say on which day of the year, right? So at the beginning, you could go to the table of contents and find out that this is January 28th, and you would figure out what prayer you should say on January 28th, right? And then you would flip to that page because the prayers were organized by theme. So there were prayers to the Virgin Mary, there were prayers to Jesus, right? Prayers to particular saints, and they were organized thematically, which meant that you couldn't just flip through it. So you went to the front, okay, I got to turn to page 530, right? I'll find the prayer for today, right? So it's a prayer book. Now, on one hand, like I said, it's utilitarian. It helps Jean de Berry find his prayers to say that day, but he owned dozens of these prayer books. So, on the other hand, they are luxury objects, right? They're collectible items over and above being utilitarian objects. They fill two very different functions, right? One holy, if you will, spiritual, and the other one utterly secular, right? It's bling. It's conspicuous consumption. And with that in mind, the single most, we've got, remember from Giotto, how some of the blue had flecked off in the Arena Chapel, right, of the robes. And that was because it was an expensive pigment, right? It was lapis lazuli, it was aquamarine blue, okay? That was the most expensive thing an artist could use at this time period, 14th, 15th century. It was more expensive than the gold leaf because it was ground up pieces of lapis lazuli that had to be imported from Turkey. Right? So that made it significantly more expensive to use, and this is just filled with it. Right? So this thing shows off its expense really obviously. Right? As his robe, the background, the sky, up above, those are zodiac symbols. Christians in the Middle Ages didn't have problems with zodiac, right? That sort of strict Protestants do today have that sort of problem. And let's see where I am here. I'm kind of ahead of myself. What's coming up next, right? This particular book, right? These prayers to be said on very particular days was called the Book of Hours, and it comes from the tradition that monks would pray at 7 particular hours out of the day, the monastic hours, right? The one we still hear about is Vespers, right? But there was matins and lauds and whatnot. And the idea that monks were praying at particular times out of the day was the idea that was adopted by lay people like Jean de Berry. He's not clergy, right? And he's going to pray as well. And they called these books that told you what prayers to say which day a book of hours, because hours meant prayers, right? And so, like I said, it started off with this calendar. And the way it worked out, right? Well, let's back up. Where am I on this? Okay, so he's buried. See, this is why it has to be front-loaded, because I can't just go back and find these things. You'd be watching me rifle through my files, right? His older brother was King Charles V, and Charles V, around 1325, 1330, decided that France was just way too big for one guy to govern. So he decided to give parts of France to his younger brothers. So we talked about Philip the Bold in Burgundy. Jean de Berry has the region called Berry, which is sort of south of Paris. The third brother got the Loire Valley, over here, right? And this is kind of a fascinating historically. Charles V is referred to as as Charles the Wise, right? In French, Charles le Sage, right? The sage, Charles the Wise. Because what happened by giving out these parts of France to his younger brothers was that when the 100 Years' War ended up leading to the invasion of Paris, right? That meant that all of France didn't fall to England, right? Henry V, right? That whole section. The Battle of Agincourt in 1420, France falls to England under the 100 Years' War. And it's really only Paris in the northern part, Normandy, that does, and not the rest of it down below. This is why the French refer to him as the wise king, right? Because it turned out that just this idea that I can't do it all by myself led to actually preserving a huge hunk of France as French during the English invasion of the early part of the 15th century. And that's all going on right around this time. Okay. So, like I said, it originally was a book. And this would have been on the left-hand page as you opened it up, right? And on the right-hand page would be the calendar for January that would tell you what page to turn to. So these are from the same book, and it opens like this. And you would flip the page for February, right? You can see it says Janvier, right? And we can go find January 28th, right? Work our way down, right? Well, in any event, you can find, and it will tell you over here on the right what page to turn to for January 28th, right? And so we're down in here, I guess, looking for our particular prayer, right? So this was a guide. And so each of these book of hours, this is for every book of hours, would start off with this calendar, right? And the tradition had become that for each month there would be an illustration of an activity that was traditionally related to that particular month. And these go all the way back to the 12th century, even earlier. They're called the labors of the month, even though they're not all laborious, right? They're not all work, right? Activity associated with the month. And the traditional activity associated with January is the feast at the beginning of the calendar year, right? The labors of the months. And we can go through the beginning of this wonderful illustrated prayer book, and the first 12 pictures are secular pictures. They're not religious pictures at all. They're activities associated with each day of the month. They're more or less scenes of everyday life, right? At least as far as Jean du Barry experienced it, right? So he opens up the page, the book. The first thing he sees is himself. That must have been pretty nice, right? Surrounded by nothing but wealth and warmth and luxury and comfort. Right? This is a life of plenty. If we turn to February, we see the other side of the coin. We see not Jean du Barry's own experience so much as the experience of the peasants who worked for him. And is presented to us as almost the polar opposite of the January page, right? In that we've got outside versus inside, cold versus warm, right? Work versus relaxation. And this is more or less Jean du Barry's idea of what a peasant life should be like. They should be working. Because after all, that's the only reason they exist, right? He's medieval equivalent of a slave owner, right? The peasants work for him in return for he'll feed them and he'll protect them in times of war, right? But any kind of profit that they make goes directly to him, right? You can never work your way out of peasantry. And we see as we look at the image, this extraordinarily realistic version of a cold winter's day, right? Now our artists are from, sorry, but that's not working. There we go. Our artists are again from the Low Countries. Even though they're working for Jean du Barry here, they are from this larger region of the Burgundian Netherlands, right? Klaus Sluter had come from Brussels, which is roughly here, before working at Dijon, right? The Limburg brothers come from the town of Nijmegen, which is all the way up there, before working for Jean du Barry over here. There's something in the water. Almost all of the artists that are making these extraordinarily realistic images are indeed from, it seems, this particular part of the Burgundian Netherlands. And that's an unexplained phenomenon as to why those artists seem to be the ones most interested in this extraordinary realism. But it holds true through the course of the 15th century, that the most realistic works of art are coming from this region. Now let's look at some of the details of this. Keep in mind that the picture on the page is maybe 8 inches tall, so our details are exploding this quite a ways, right? And you can see the words that are on the back of this page, because remember that each page has on its back, right, the calendar, and so the words that you see there are the January calendar on the back of this page, right? But there we see one of the peasants going off to market in the little village, the ruts in the road sliding, right? They're slippery, but also the extraordinary cold. We see the smoke coming out of the stack here because there's a fire in the lower left corner. They do have some warmth, but not a whole lot. Right? We have this great detail of them gathering sticks. I love how the snow, they spend a lot of time carefully observing. They've done this a couple weeks ago, right? And seeing how snow falls in the sort of the crotch of the tree branch, right? And pools up specifically there. This figure in the lower right corner. My wife and I were watching a movie this weekend. I can't remember what it was, but anymore, it just bothers the hell out of me because they've got this digitally produced steam from people's mouths now. Like, it's really cold, and you can tell it's really cold because there's snow on the ground, but somehow they feel they got to go digitally put the steam coming in. Well, our Limburg brothers have kind of done that here, right? And you can see that this figure, probably a woman, also has snow sort of stuck to the tops of her shoes as they trod through this extraordinarily cold environment, the alternative to Jean du Barry's warmth and luxury. Seeds for the birds who have gathered. Again, the poverty of the peasants reflected through the hole in the ceiling. The sheep huddled together against the cold, right? Just these wonderful details that show a lot of observation and a great priority placed on trying to render that reality as closely and in as much detail as possible. The last detail I have is of the peasants inside the room, and they've got a bed back there. They're going to huddle together against the cold as well, right? So a big bed for everyone, and they're in front of the fire. Remember that Jean du Barry had such a big fireplace that he had that fire screen, right? Sort of protect him from the fire to disperse the heat through the room. Well, theirs is so small, their fire, that they have to lift up their clothing, right, to warm themselves. And you'll notice you get to see their naughty peasant as well, right? A little 15th century nudity in the image. You see a guy in the middle's penis and the woman behind him, hers as well. And on a certain level, this is also, it demeans them, it debases them. Because for Jean de Berry, the peasant owner, right, they're not at the same status as him. And this, coupled with the torn and tattered clothing, suggests that they are at a lower level of respectability. Right? The nudity becomes a way of simply debasing them. And that's something that Jean de Berry would have appreciated, right? And it's something that appears throughout the rest of this manuscript. Okay, so we were looking at now, as we talked about International Gothic, right? We were looking at patronage as a driver of the transmission of style. That Philip the Bold of Burgundy, who kept his primary residence in Dijon, helps the International Gothic style to spread here. And as we just saw, Jean de Berry, next door, if you will, helped the International Gothic style to spread there. And it's becoming, as we get into the 15th century, that International Gothic style is becoming something extraordinarily realistic, right? It simply starts out as being sort of three-dimensional, right? Little elegance under Simone Martini, sort of linear quality, sort of refinement. But as we get around 1400, that style has blossomed into being something extraordinarily realistic, right? And that's what we're going to continue to look at. So all of the artists that we've been looking at, all the ones that we can document, have gotten their start in Flanders, which is one of the counties owned by Philip the Bold of Burgundy. He married the Countess of Flanders. That's how he got this territory, right? Margaret of Maul, if you're into that sort of thing. And all of our artists have come from this region, regardless of where they're working. Right? And what we're going to do is continue to investigate works of art made in this region in the 15th century, later, right? And what we're going to see is that the kind of realism that we're beginning to see, right, with International Gothic style, becomes even more extraordinary as we move deeper into the 15th century with works of art produced in Flanders. Right? Flanders today is like half of Belgium. And the period that we're going to be looking at is still governed by the Duke of Burgundy, but it's now governed by Philip the Bold's grandson, who, just to make things confusing, is Philip the Good. Right? To this day, right, royal names, right? Look at the British royal house, right? Why are they all Charles and Williams? Because that's just a traditional name. And so Philip is one of the 2 or 3 names that anybody associated with the French royal house will choose, right? Charles, Philip, right? These are normal, recurring names. So here's Philip the Good, the grandson of Philip the Bold, and he is the leader, the Duke of Burgundy, this entire region he inherits, throughout the course of the 15th century. He dies already, in 1567. So he's around for most of the 15th century. Right? So again, Flanders, that's a bit out of order. Right? The work on your right, down in the National Gallery, one of my favorite paintings. And by the way, they're opening up on Tuesday. So, now that we got money for 3 weeks for the government, the NGA will open back up. But they couldn't do it right away because they got to get things cleaned up and ready for us, right? So you can go to the NGA for free, your tax money at work, as of Tuesday. You can see this. Van Eyck's Annunciation, Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck was the court painter to Philip the Bold, or Philip the Good. See, that's the word thing. Court painter. This is like a lawyer on retainer for a corporation, right? What Van Eyck got as being court painter was he got his rent paid, he got an annual stipend, and he got money whenever Philip called on him to do anything, right? And it's also allowed him to continue to work on his own. But he had to sort of drop everything when the Duke came calling. Okay? So he's court painter. This is a traditional title that goes back to the 13th century. We'll go forward into the 17th century. We'll find court painters. We'll see quite a few court painters in this class. Right? He was court painter to Duke Philip. It's going to be a great job. Right? Imagine somebody paying you just to say, hey, drop everything and come see me when you want. Right? And you can still continue to work for other people. And it looks like most of the people that Van Eyck worked for were people who were associated with the Duke of Burgundy. So the Arnolfinis, worksheet number 3 that some of you have done, right? The Arnolfinis were friends of Duke Philip the Good. In fact, had loaned him money at one point. That's how wealthy they were, right? They had helped actually finance Philip the Good's wedding, right? So there's a close connection between Van Eyck's patrons and the Duke, and this is because he's court painter to the Duke of Burgundy. Right? That's coming up next. And he's active primarily in the city of Bruges, which is a great city to visit. It still looks like it did in Van Eyck's day. It's really a fairly well-preserved medieval city with canals, and you can actually go see the house where Van Eyck lived. Right? It's not open to the public, but there's a plaque on the wall. Right? This is where he spent the majority of his career. His connection with Philip, as court painter, was more than just an artist. He was also functioned as a diplomat of sorts. At one point, Philip, 1629, is about to get married. He's going to marry the Princess of Portugal. Marriage diplomacy, right? How do you extend your realm? You marry into that family. He's going to marry Isabella of Portugal. But he wants to see what she looks like. Even though most marriages have nothing to do with love, it's all about sort of arranging fortunes, you know. He still wants to see what she, so he sends Van Eyck to go see her and send him back 2 pictures of her because he's so realistic, right? And he sends one by land and one by sea so he can look at her. Oh, okay, good enough, right? And then he says Van Eyck's going to stay there and accompany her back once he's made his mind up, right? So he's got a pretty close connection with the Duke, right? And what's interesting about Van Eyck is that there are very, very few pictures that actually survive that he painted for the Duke. And this is one of them, at least so far as we think, right? We think that this one was actually made for that monastery. Remember the monastery of Champmall, the charter house of Champmall that was founded by Philip's grandfather? Right? Became the burial site for Philip the Bold's offspring, his legacy, would all be buried there. So just as Philip the Good inherited the realm, he also inherited this building. And he too donated works to it. Right? And this one we think was there because there's an inventory back to the 18th century that mentions an altarpiece with an image of the Annunciation in it, right? And it makes sense that this might be the one, right? Let's see what's coming up. There it is. So it's probably in the chapel at Champmont, here, which we just looked at a minute ago. Now, the reference to it from the 18th century says that it was part of an altarpiece. Altarpieces in this period, especially in Northern Europe, took the form of a triptych. Very different from the Italian format. Remember the Italian format had the big painting in the middle with a predella down below, right? Or maybe multiple scenes side by side with a predella down below. Well, in the north, altarpieces took the form of what's called a triptych. 3 wings, right? A central body with 2 side wings that would fold over and cover up the body. So the central body is twice as wide as either of the wings. Now with this one, we don't have the rest of it. It's not survived. The central body or the right wing are both missing. Right? We don't even know what the subject matter was. But we're pretty sure that this was the left wing of a triptych for 2 reasons. One, the format of the piece, which is stretched out vertically, suggests a triptych wing. That's the format we normally see, rather than standard picture formats, right? Like the paper you're writing on, right? Rather than sort of golden rectangle. Okay? The second thing is, if you look at the perspective in the scene, how the architecture is laid out, you'll notice that it drags your eye off to the right. You see the left-hand side of the building, but you don't see the right-hand side of the building. And that pulls your eye from the picture toward the center. That suggests that it was the left wing rather than the right wing. Its composition was on the right, it would drag your eye out of the space. And whatever picture was on the left would probably do the same, or the right, would do the same thing from the other side. Would drag our eye inward. Bill, are you doing the Bosch or is that Trey? It's not you? Okay. Somebody's picked up a painting by Bosch, and it does the same thing. It's a left-hand wing. Right? And they would have folded over, and there might well have been something on the outside of them as well. Right? But they're painted on wooden panels rather than canvas, which means that a dealer who wants to sell this thing could conceivably sell each of these pictures separately, and if he's really good, he can take that wooden panel and shave it in half this way and sell two different pictures that are on thinner pieces of wood, right? And we see that happening all the time, right? Pieces that were once the front and back of the same picture, okay? So all we have is the front of this one. We don't know what was on the back of it originally. We don't know what was in the center or on the right, or on the back of what was on the right. There are no pictures from Van Eyck that survive that are the right dimensions to be this way. Right? And part of the reason they don't survive is that when Protestantism began in the 16th century, Protestants destroyed images in churches because they felt that violated the second commandment. And so about 90% of the pictures from the 15th century that were made in Northern Europe, the area most affected by the Reformation, about 90% of them have been destroyed. We have just the tip of the iceberg to look at. And the ones that haven't been destroyed are the ones that were prized the most, right? So Van Eyck's Annunciation down at the National Gallery, as we look at it in detail, what we'll see is that it's traditional in that it has some of the same motifs that we've seen before, but at the same time it's innovative in that it's significantly more realistic than even the International Gothic stuff, right? So, right, let's compare it to this Walter's Annunciation from only, 30 years earlier, right, 35 years earlier, okay? Angel from the left, red robe, kneeling, right, points toward heaven. We've seen that in other pictures of the Annunciation. The angel's pointing to whence it came, right? Virgin on the right, reading, right, book on the little podium, right? Pages of the book lifting a little bit, right? We can't read the pages in the Van Eyck, so they're not her words like they were in the Walters piece. And the Walters piece creates a throne for her that is this sort of quasi-building, right? That looks like architecture over her head. And what Van Eyck has done is to put it in, well, what kind of building is that? What does it look like? The palace? The townhouse? It's a church, right? He actually places this image in the church. And if you look at it as a church, and you think about churches, if either of them were to stand up, because the angel is kneeling again, and the Virgin Mary is also kneeling in front of her book, if either of them stand up, they're all the way to the attic, right? They're not scaled properly for the building. Again, that hieratic scale we talked about, right? More important things are bigger, okay? It might be also symbolic, because churches in the Middle Ages were dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, right, in Paris. So she is the church. And to have her be that big is kind of symbolic of the fact that she's the church. There's that possibility. Other things similar, right? A dove of the Holy Spirit coming down, right, toward the forehead of the Virgin Mary. Differences, right? She's looking at us rather than at the angel. It's almost like she's engaging with us, and she's at that first moment of surprise, right? Again, that idea that the Virgin goes through different stages of recognition. Now, as we look at it in close-up, the detail is extraordinary, right? The realism is extraordinary. We can see little frescoes on the wall behind Isaac labeled, right? Esau's on the other side. And here comes the dove of the Holy Spirit, modeled in 3 dimensions in much more realism than anything we've seen up to this point. And you can see that it's coming through a window that is neither open nor broken. Right, so how did it get in here? Well, I guess it doesn't matter because it's not a real dove, right? It's the Holy Spirit. It's a symbol of the Holy Spirit. So it doesn't need the window to be open for the dove of the Holy Spirit to come in. Right? There's a close-up of the window that is coming through. All of the windows have the same color scheme, see the blue and the red that we see down below, are picked up in the building itself. Now, this idea that the dove of the Holy Spirit has come through a closed window also relates back to a standard theological idea that helps to explain this miracle, right? When we talk about miracles, in lay Middle Ages, people wanted proof. They are not proof, but explanation. And you shouldn't try to explain miracles because it's a miracle. You don't explain it, right? It's God. It doesn't have to obey the rules that you and I do day to day. But how do you explain it? How can she be pregnant and still be a virgin? And 13th century theologian came up with this great idea that became incredibly popular. And he says the virgin is utterly pure. In fact, she's the vessel most pure. Right? A pure vessel containing Christ. And she is as pure and as clean and as transparent as glass. And if natural light can pass through glass without breaking it, then why can't the light of God pass through this pure vessel that is the Virgin Mary and leave her, quote unquote, unbroken? Right? That was the metaphor. And that seems to be a metaphor that Van Eyck loves, because he loves painting things with glass. And see lots of his images that the fall of light in this building is part of the theme that he's working with the entire picture. How light comes through glass, right? Is reiterated in different places. So here we get that idea. As light passes through glass and leaves it unbroken, so the light of God can pass into the vessel most pure and leave her intact. And Van Eyck is playing with that same idea. Now, the Walters piece gives us God up above, right? Alpha and Omega. He appears in the Van Eyck as well, but a little bit more subtle. He's in the window up above. Right? So there's the God of the Old Testament appearing up above. So there's these traditional elements that have been rendered more realistically. Rather than the heavens opening up and this little figure of God gesturing down, we see him incorporated into the realism of the building that we see. Her book also appears in both Van Eyck's, even though we don't read the words. Right? The words are, in fact, realistically scaled to the book, right? As opposed to the ones in the Walters piece, which are big enough that you can read them. Van Eyck depicts them big enough so she can read them. And I've looked at enough 15th century books to tell you that that idea of using 2 colors for the initial letters is absolutely accurate. Now, we can't read any of the words. There's little ticks of lines. But boy, does it look like we ought to be able to, right? And he's really concerned with where lines end and start, and it's not consistent. So you almost get the sense that if you spend enough time and got really lucky, you might find that book, right, in that particular page. And medieval books, right, weren't on paper. They were on vellum, calves' skin, right? The Book of Hours that we saw from the Limerick Brothers, that was on calves' skin. Right? And that crinkliness of the calf's skin, Van Eyck captures perfectly, right? And we can even see the parts of the letters on the page down below as it opens up. Her wonderful little pearl-studded bookmark, right, that's on a stick that lays into that page to keep it open for that page. But flipping a little bit as the angel comes in. This is typical of the kind of realism, extraordinary realism that began in the International Gospel that is now absolutely extraordinary in the middle of the 15th century, right? Van Eyck is achieving these effects because he's using a new kind of paint, right? Giotto Duccio used tempera paint when they painted panels, right? And then frescoes were watercolor with fresh plaster, right? Tempera paint, remember they have the pigment, which is the dry stuff, ground up and emulsified into egg yolk, and it dries opaque. Right? Van Eyck is using oil paint, so he's using that same sort of dried material, but instead of mixing it into egg yolk, he's mixing it into linseed oil, right? And that means that the particles, as they're dispersed inside the oil, and he lays it on the canvas, you can actually see through them ever so slightly, depending on how much pigment is there. You can see through them to the layers below. And Van Eyck applies his paint in layer upon thin layer upon thin layer, and they seem almost as if they glow from within, right? So the effect that we're getting on this, diamondy screen is not dissimilar from what you see in reality, right? And oil paints dry significantly more slowly than tempera paint. And this, we think, is why Van Eyck is using it, because it allows him now to blend the brush strokes. And when he lays things, and remember when we looked at the close-up of Giotto, we could see the lines on the Madonna's cheek and the Madonna that's done at the National Gallery. We saw these individual hair-like lines that he's using, painting her face and building it up, right? And each one is opaque. You can't see through it. It's like blending a pencil. Van Eyck, as he lays down the brush strokes, will come back over and blend them together. So as you look at the picture, even in the extraordinary detail, and the entire picture is about like that, fairly large piece, right? So the detail we've got here is probably maybe this, right? The size of a half an envelope or something like that, postcard. What he'll come back do is he lays down the brush strokes, is he'll go back over and blend them together. So it has this sort of enamel finish, where it almost looks as if you can't see anything the artist actually did. Does that make sense? Right? When you see those lines, you say, oh, I can see how Giotto painted that. I can see those lines. And with Van Eyck, you can't. Right? It's almost as if it was made by magic. And he's so good with oil paint that the legend rose up that he had actually invented oil paint. But that's not true. Right? It's just that there's nobody else that was better at it than he was. Right? Other people are using it even before Van Eyck. But he sort of understands the medium and exactly what it can do. Right, so let's look at some of these details. Right, there's the angel, and instead of holding the words on the scroll, it goes back to the earlier idea of having them hang in air. Right, but he doesn't. Since we've gotten rid of that artificial gold background in lieu of this incredibly realistic setting, the words just hang there coming out of the angel's mouth. Ave. That's an abbreviation, gratia plena, right? Hail, full of grace, right? And the little thing above is like a period that we use when we, or an apostrophe when we abbreviate things. Keep in mind, we'll see close-ups of other things, but look at the details of the jewels. Absolutely, again, the idea that the fall of light is sort of the central theme that he's working with. Look at the fall of light on all the different jewels, the sapphires, the rubies, the pearls, right? Or the gold as well. And you can see that it's a fairly consistent fall of light. And what's kind of fascinating is that the light in the building is coming from the upper left, isn't it? But the light on the pearls is coming from the upper right. So is he making a distinction between spiritual light and real light? Is the light on the pearls coming from our world into his? Right? We don't know exactly where this was hung, but that seems to be something that maybe he was playing with. Even the shadow on the stool in the foreground, right, comes from our world, and it casts the shadow back into the picture. The Virgin hears this, looks out at us, and answers. And remember that her answer is, "Behold the handmaiden of God." Right? That's her final sort of acquiescence to the message. Right? Her final submission. I'm servant. Right? Behold the handmaiden of God. And her words, they're upside down. Can you read that? Ecce and Chila, and again an abbreviation, Domini. So it's E-C-C-E coming from the right to the left and upside down. This is something that Eyck does twice in his career, and both times there's an image of God up above. So some people think that God's supposed to look down and read that, and it's set up for him, right? But also, the words are meant to be coming out of her mouth. So you read them in the direction that the sound travels, away from her lips, right? So it goes back toward the angel, which is why Van Eyck has put them upside down. There's a nice close-up of her, where we can see again his phenomenal level of detail. Individual hairs painted one by one by one, especially as they cascade down over the ermine collar of her robe. Her eyes are blue, and you can see the light sort of coming through the lens on her eyes. You can tell the degree to which the lips are wet, rather than the skin which is dry. And just like John, you can see her teeth, right? She's opening her mouth as she speaks, and we get to look inside her mouth. Right? Those pearls again, rubies, all picked out with extraordinary detail. And I think it's sort of fascinating, again, this different play of light. Most of the light that hits her is coming from our side. But there's a little tuft of light on the bottom, on the side of her chin here, and catching sort of the edge of her mouth there, right? And those seem to be coming from the angel. So there's this play of light within it, between natural and supernatural light, that infuses the entire painting. When we talk about light and how it plays through the picture, one of the more extraordinary details, for me at least, is the windows behind the Virgin Mary. They're just extraordinary. They're painted on this mullioned glass, like the bottoms of beer bottles, right? They're sort of made by blowing and spinning, right? As you blow, and it comes up with that sort of, they call it bullshot glass or mullioned glass, right? It's thicker in the middle where it was attached to the glass blower's tube, right? And what they do, because of the different thicknesses of glasses, they refract, right? So as you look down below, you can see that the sky outside the window is catching the bottoms of those circles at the bottom, right? And the ground, the green bits of the landscape, pick up on the top parts of the circles up above. What an amazing amount of close observation, but also of an almost finicky attention to detail in painting. Right? This level of realism and paying that kind of close attention to it is absolutely extraordinary. We see it everywhere. There's a close-up of the angel's hand. It's a little blurry. I think another one of these, but you can see that the angel's carrying this crystal scepter, sign of royalty of heaven, right, in its hand. And look at how the light passes through the crystal, right? It works like a magnifying glass. And we can see the light hitting the outside of the crystal here, refracting on the inside of the crystal there, and then magnifying onto the hand of the angel that's holding it. Again, close detail, extraordinary detail. And this is the thing that Van Eyck is, I believe, by far most interested in, is the play of light. All of these jewels. You would think that we could go out and find that jewel, because it's so realistic. He must have just had a piece that he borrowed from the Duke that he used, right? But we've not identified any of the jewels that Van Eyck ever paints. They seem to be made up, invented, but so extraordinarily realistic that the pearls, he catches not only how the light falls on them, but how they reflect the things around them on the back, and how they're translucent, like pearls really are, or how the jewels have different levels of transparency. The sapphire, slightly milky, right, and catching some of the light on its facets. Other jewels, extraordinarily transparent, right? And just, it is beautifully detailed. And the details often help to add to meaning. So on one level, we can see behind the head of the Virgin Mary that there are 3 windows. Now, 3 to Christians is obvious, right? It's the Holy Trinity. And these 3 windows, light, God, are different colors. One is yellow, one is blue, one is red. Well, for Christians, the Trinity is God, Father, Holy Spirit. These are 3 things that are the same but different. Right? One but independent. And that mystery, theological mystery, might be picked up in some of the details that Van Eyck gives us. On the floor, he paints inscribed biblical scenes into the tiles of the floor with zodiac signs as well. Right? And they show David slaying Goliath. You see him here? There's the giant Goliath. There's young King David. He's climbed up on his body after he's thrown the rock. Right? You can see the rock still there in the middle of his forehead. And he's about to lop off his head. Samson tearing down the temple. Mighty Samson pulling down the temple. Both of these scenes are scenes that treat the theme of triumph over one's enemies. Good triumphing over evil, if you will. And these are directly beneath the feet of the moment when Christ comes to earth to triumph over sin. So the details that he adds nuance and enhance the meaning of the piece, right, in a very extraordinary way. And 25 years or so ago, the painting went under conservation. It was cleaned. And one of the things we found out when we cleaned the image, when they cleaned the image, we cleaned it because we paid for it. Right? But when the image was cleaned in the early 90s, one of the things they found that under the varnish that had yellowed and darkened was that the ceiling is missing some of its panels. Which became sort of, we hadn't known that. And all of a sudden we go, well, what's going on with that? Why has he given us a church that needs repair? Well, again, this fits the theology from a Christian standpoint. Christ came to fix things. The old dispensation, Judaism, from a Christian perspective, was coming up short. Christ came to repair. Christ came to make good again. And this is taking place in a temple that needs repair. So it underscores the overall theme. And this is true for everything in the picture, right? I could go on and on. Maybe it already seems like I'm going on and on. But there's more, right? In this picture that suggests that these meanings are intentional on Van Eyck's part, probably dictated by Philip the Good, maybe with the help of a theological advisor, that as he's working on the picture, and by the way, we know from x-rays that a lot of these things were added later, right, as he was working. They were not part of the original plan. We know from x-rays that there were no tiles in the floor. It was just diamond pattern, right? He changed his mind for some reason. Probably advised to add things that elaborated, nuanced, developed the symbolic meaning of the piece. Right? And that combination, right, of extraordinary realism on the one hand and symbolic meaning on the other within those details is a hallmark of 15th century art in this particular region. Right? And we'll see it in 2 or 3 more examples before we move on. Okay? Look at that. Timing. 9:15. We'll look at another Van Eyck. We'll look at some others from this period on Thursday. Move on to Italy from that point. We're not that far behind given snow days and all of that, so we're doing okay. Again, Thursday will be the, I'll go back to the office right now and announce it. Thursday will be the 3rd worksheet, which is on Van Eyck, right? One of his portraits that's in London. And remember that today you need to register with me your term paper topics and your top 3 choices. And those of you that did it over the weekend, I'm just behind in my email. Okay? So I'll be doing that as soon as I get back to my office.